Her foot slipped slightly on the cold wood floor, a small sound, skin meeting polish, that felt louder than it should have. Rachel steadied herself with the back of the chair, fingers tightening until the chair answered back. The house was awake before she was. Light pressed through the glass walls, thin and pale, as if testing the room. Somewhere outside, a gull cut the air once and disappeared. She had been standing there for longer than she realized, barefoot, coffee cooling in her hand. The steam had already thinned. She didn't lift the mug again. She just stood, watching her reflection fragment in the window. Her shoulder doubled by the glass, her mouth slightly parted, as if she had been interrupted mid-thought. It wasn't sadness. That was what unsettled her most. The message on her phone sat unread on the counter, face down. She knew what it said. Delay. Light. Apology wrapped in efficiency. Daniel's absence had developed a rhythm over the last year, predictable enough to feel almost intentional. She had stopped marking time by his returns. Instead, she marked it by mornings like this, when her body woke first and her mind followed slowly, reluctantly, like a second tide. The doorbell rang. The sound moved through the house without resistance, clean and contained. Rachel's shoulders lifted and fell once. She crossed the room, each step deliberate, not hurried, not slow. When she opened the door, the air changed. Claire stood on the threshold with her bag slung low on one shoulder, hair pulled back, a faint line of concentration already set between her brows. She wore dark leggings, a gray tank, nothing remarkable, and yet the space adjusted around her as if recognizing a new center of gravity. "Morning," Claire said, her voice steady, warm without asking anything. Rachel nodded. "You're right on time. I try to be." They shared a brief smile, polite, contained. Rachel stepped aside and Claire entered, wiping her shoes on the mat without being told. The gesture was small, automatic, and Rachel noticed it with an attention that surprised her. She closed the door behind them. The house settled again. They moved through the space together without speaking. Claire set her bag down near the window, rolled out the mat with practiced ease. Rachel placed the coffee mug in the sink, rinsed it longer than necessary, listening to the water. When she turned back, Claire was already stretching, spine lengthening, breath controlled. Watching her felt like tuning into a frequency that had always been there, just slightly out of range. "Whenever you're ready," Claire said. Rachel joined her on the mat. The movements were familiar now, shoulders circling, hips loosening, breath finding its way back into neglected corners. Claire demonstrated, then mirrored Rachel's form, close enough to correct without crowding. The room filled with the quiet sounds of effort, fabric shifting, breath deepening, the soft thud of feet returning to the mat. It was easy, this part. It asked nothing beyond attention. Rachel focused on the count, on the steady cadence of Claire's voice. Yet her thoughts drifted anyway, circling a question she had been carrying for weeks without touching directly. It wasn't a question about desire. It was about recognition, about what it meant to feel seen in a way that didn't require explanation. She had always been good at translating herself. To her parents, to teachers, to Daniel. She adjusted her edges, smoothed her tone, chose words that would land gently. It had felt like competence once. Lately, it felt like erasure. "Breathe into your ribs," Claire said, stepping closer. Her fingers hovered, then landed lightly at Rachel's side, guiding. The touch was brief, precise, and Rachel's breath caught anyway, sharp and uninvited. She corrected it immediately, inhaling as instructed. But something had already shifted. The sensation lingered after Claire stepped back. Not heat exactly. More like a wake, the trace of movement after a boat has passed. Rachel felt it settle along her side, down into her hip, as if her body were marking the contact for later. They moved through the sequence without interruption. Claire's voice remained even, professional. Rachel followed, grateful for the structure, for the way the exercises demanded her full attention. Still, her mind kept returning to that single point of contact, replaying it with quiet insistence. The way Claire hadn't apologized. The way she hadn't lingered. When they paused for water, they stood side by side at the counter. Claire unscrewed her bottle, drank, wiped her mouth with the back of her hand. Rachel noticed the small scar on Claire's wrist, pale against tanned skin. An old injury, healed but not erased. She wanted to ask about it. She didn't. Instead, she took a sip of water and let the silence stretch. It wasn't uncomfortable. It felt deliberate, like a held note. "You paint?" Claire said finally, nodding toward the canvas propped against the wall. Rachel followed her gaze. The painting was unfinished, as always. Broad strokes of blue and green, a suggestion of horizon without commitment. She had started it months ago and returned to it again and again, never crossing the same line twice. "I try," she said. Claire stepped closer, studying the canvas without touching it. "It feels like it's waiting." "For what?" "For you to decide where you're standing." The words settled between them, heavier than they should have been. Rachel felt a familiar tightening in her chest, the urge to deflect, to laugh it off. She resisted. Instead, she nodded once. They returned to the mat. The rest of the session passed in a quiet blur, lunges, planks, controlled movements that left Rachel's muscles humming. Claire corrected her posture once more, a hand at her lower back, firm and brief. Each time, Rachel's body responded faster than her thoughts, breath hitching, skin alert. Outside, a car passed on the road below, the sound distant and indifferent. A plane crossed the sky, leaving a thin white line that dissolved almost immediately. The world continued, unaware. When the session ended, Claire rolled up the mat and shouldered her bag. "Same time tomorrow?" she asked. "Yes," Rachel said too quickly. She caught herself, softened her tone. "If that works for you." "It does." They walked to the door together. For a moment, they stood facing each other, the space between them measured, intentional. Claire's gaze held Rachel's, steady, unreadable. Rachel felt a familiar pull then, not toward Claire exactly, but toward the possibility she represented. Toward a version of herself that did not need to translate. "I'll see you," Claire said. Rachel nodded. "Tomorrow." The door closed softly. Rachel remained where she was, hand resting against the wood, listening to the quiet that followed. It felt different now. Charged. Expectant. She turned back toward the room, her eyes drawn to the canvas. The horizon seemed closer than it had before, the space between colors narrowing. She picked up a brush, hesitated, then set it down again. Some decisions could wait. Others had already begun. A warmth lingered along her side, faint but insistent, as if her body were reminding her of something she hadn't yet allowed herself to name. She stood there, breathing, letting the sensation settle, knowing it would return. Rachel noticed the absence first, not the presence. It was the space Claire usually occupied near the window, the quiet assumption of her body there, that lingered even before the doorbell rang. Rachel had already rolled out the mat, already opened the curtains. The morning light had shifted slightly, less tentative than the day before. She stood in the kitchen, rinsing a mug that didn't need it, aware of the way her attention kept turning toward the front door, as if it were capable of breathing on its own. When the bell finally sounded, it landed inside her with a muted relief. Not excitement, not anticipation. Relief, as if something had been returned to its proper place. Claire entered with the same unremarkable steadiness, shoes wiped, bag set down. Nothing in her demeanor suggested awareness of the subtle recalibration that had taken place inside Rachel since their last meeting. That, too, was a relief. "Morning," Claire said again, as if yesterday had not altered the air between them. "Morning." They moved through the warm-up together, bodies finding a rhythm that now felt less instructional and more shared. The movements no longer required explanation. Rachel knew where her arms were meant to land, how her breath should travel. Claire's corrections were fewer, more economical. When they came, they felt like refinements rather than guidance. Afterward, they lingered in the kitchen. Coffee brewed. Claire leaned against the counter while Rachel poured, the simple choreography of mugs and spoons unfolding without comment. Outside, a neighbor's dog barked once, then settled. The ordinary sounds felt amplified, as if the house were holding its breath around them. They stood close enough that Rachel could feel the warmth from Claire's arm, a quiet presence that asked nothing. She resisted the urge to shift closer to test the boundary. Instead, she focused on the steam rising from her cup, the way it dissipated into the light. "You don't rush," Claire said suddenly. Rachel looked up. "What? Anything?" Claire clarified, gesturing vaguely with her mug. "Most people do, even when they don't need to." Rachel considered this. She had rushed for so long that stillness felt like a discipline. "I think I learned not to," she said finally. "Or maybe I forgot how." Claire nodded as if this made sense. They drank in silence, the pause stretching comfortably between them. Later, as they moved through a slower sequence on the mat, Rachel became aware of the way Claire mirrored her pace, adjusting without instruction. It felt like a conversation conducted through breath and muscle, subtle and precise. When Claire knelt to demonstrate a stretch, Rachel's gaze lingered on the line of her neck, the small movement of her throat as she swallowed. She looked away quickly, unsettled by the specificity of her attention. Inside, her thoughts had begun to sharpen. No longer a general unease, but a growing awareness of something forming just beyond the language. She recognized the pattern, this slow narrowing of focus. The way certain details began to recur, demanding notice. It reminded her of the early stages of a painting, when the canvas resisted clarity, when every choice felt provisional. The shift came quietly. Claire reached to adjust Rachel's shoulder, her hand resting there a fraction longer than necessary. Not a mistake. Not an indulgence. Just a pause that acknowledged itself. Rachel's breath faltered, then steadied. She did not pull away. They both seemed to register the moment without reacting to it. The exercise continued. Yet the room felt subtly altered, as if something had tilted and not yet found its balance. After the session, they walked to the garden together. Claire suggested a cool down outside, and Rachel agreed, grateful for the openness of the space. The grass was still damp, cool under their feet. They moved through gentle stretches, the sky widening above them. Rachel noticed how Claire positioned herself nearby without encroaching, attentive to the shared line of sight toward the horizon. A breeze passed, lifting strands of Rachel's hair. Claire reached out instinctively, then stopped herself, hand hovering before dropping back to her side. The restraint was palpable. Rachel felt it settle into her body like a held breath. "Sorry," Claire said quietly. "For what?" "For almost." Claire stopped, smiled faintly. "Never mind." Rachel nodded, accepting the unfinished sentence. Some things were better left suspended. The world intruded gently. A jogger passed on the path beyond the fence, headphones in, oblivious. A phone buzzed inside the house. Rachel's, she realized distantly. She ignored it. Time moved forward, regardless, indifferent to the careful attention unfolding in the garden. When they finished, Claire packed her things with the same unhurried precision as before. At the door, they paused. The goodbye felt heavier now, weighted with unspoken acknowledgement. "Tomorrow?" Claire asked. "Yes," Rachel said. This time, she did not soften it. After Claire left, Rachel returned to the canvas. She did not paint. Instead, she traced the horizon with her eyes, noting how it seemed to have shifted overnight, the colors deepening almost imperceptibly. She thought of the way Claire's hand had hovered, the apology that hadn't been necessary. The thought returned again and again, settling into a quiet fixation. That evening, as the house filled with the low hum of dusk, Rachel found herself replaying the morning in fragments. The shared coffee, the held pause, the almost touch. None of it resolved into clarity. Instead, it lingered, a sensation without conclusion. She went to bed later than usual, the sheets cool against her skin. Sleep came slowly. When it did, it was threaded with images of open space and held breath, of moments suspended just long enough to be felt. Rachel became aware of it the moment she woke, the way the morning seemed to lean toward her, as if it already knew something she didn't yet have words for. The light was stronger today, less tentative. It spread across the floor in wide bands, touching the legs of the chair, the edge of the rug, her bare foot resting against the cold. She stayed still longer than necessary, listening to the house settle, to the distant sound of traffic rising and falling like breath. Everything felt closer. Not urgent, not dramatic, just nearer, as if the distance between objects and between thoughts had narrowed overnight. She carried that awareness with her as she moved through the familiar motions of the morning, filling the kettle, rinsing a mug, opening the curtains. Each action felt newly weighted, as though it might be observed, remembered. By the time the doorbell rang, her body had already oriented itself toward the sound. She didn't smile when she opened the door. She didn't need to. Claire stood there with the same quiet composure, yet Rachel noticed the difference immediately. The way Claire's gaze lingered a fraction longer before settling, the way her shoulders seemed more alert, as if braced against an invisible current. They exchanged greetings without ceremony, but the words landed differently, charged with recognition. They moved into the routine they had established, mat unrolled, windows open, the room arranged just so. It was familiar now, almost domestic. Claire began the warm-up sequence without prompting, and Rachel followed, grateful for the structure. The movements grounded her, gave her hands something to do besides tremble. As they worked, Rachel felt the subtle recalibration taking place. Every instruction carried an undertone, every pause held potential. When Claire corrected her stance, the touch was deliberate and contained, her hand resting at Rachel's elbow just long enough to be felt, then withdrawing. Rachel noticed the care in that restraint, the way it honored both of them. Later, they sat on the floor stretching, backs against the wall. Rachel's knee brushed Claire's thigh, an accident easily corrected. Neither of them moved right away. The contact was light, unassuming, yet Rachel's breath shifted instinctively, her body responding before her thoughts could intervene. She waited, attentive to Claire's reaction. Claire did not pull away. She adjusted her position slightly, allowing the contact to remain, transformed from accident to choice. The consent in that small adjustment felt unmistakable, a quiet agreement that required no word. They stayed like that for several breaths, the world narrowing to the space between their bodies. Rachel became acutely aware of the texture of the floor beneath her palms, the warmth radiating from Claire's leg, the steady rhythm of her own pulse. It felt like standing at the edge of something vast, the horizon stretching wider the longer she looked. Inside, her thoughts began to circle more tightly. This was not confusion. It was recognition, edged with caution. She thought of Daniel, of the easy affection that had gradually thinned into something practical, reliable, distant. She thought of the years she had spent translating herself into shapes that fit, careful not to demand too much space. Now sitting here, she felt the weight of a different question pressing gently but persistently. What would it mean to stop adjusting? The shift came when Claire spoke her name. Rachel. Not as instruction, not as correction, just her name, placed carefully into the quiet. Rachel turned her head. Their faces were close enough now that she could see the fine lines at the corners of Claire's eyes, the slight tension in her jaw. Claire's gaze did not move to Rachel's mouth. It stayed with her eyes, steady and searching, as if waiting for permission. Rachel did not look away. She felt the crossing begin there, not in touch, but in stillness, in the way neither of them rushed to fill the space. Claire's hand lifted slowly, stopping halfway between them, palm open. The question in the gesture was unmistakable. Rachel answered by leaning forward just enough to close the distance. The movement was small, but it carried the weight of decision. Claire's hand came to rest lightly against Rachel's arm, fingers warm, grounding. They paused again, suspended, breath mingling. When their lips met, it was gentle, almost tentative. Not a claiming, not a taking. Just contact, soft, exploratory, held for a moment longer than necessary. Rachel felt the world tilt, not violently, but irrevocably. The kiss ended before it could gather momentum, both of them pulling back at the same time, as if guided by the same internal signal. They stayed close, foreheads nearly touching. Rachel's body hummed with sensation, every nerve awake. She noticed the faint tremor in Claire's breath, the way her fingers tightened briefly before releasing. The restraint itself felt intimate, charged with intention. Neither of them spoke. Words would have flattened the moment, forced it into shape too soon. Instead, they sat there, absorbing the aftershock. Rachel felt warmth spread through her chest, down into her stomach, a steady glow that did not dissipate when she closed her eyes. Eventually, a world reasserted itself. A phone vibrated somewhere in the house. Rachel's, she realized with a distant part of her mind. A car door slammed outside. Life continued, indifferent and precise. Claire shifted back, creating space without withdrawing entirely. The movement felt careful, respectful. "We should," she began, then stopped. She smiled faintly, a touch of uncertainty breaking through her composure. "We don't have to decide anything." Rachel nodded. The relief she felt surprised her, not because the decision was unwelcome, but because the absence of pressure felt like a gift. "I know," she said. Her voice sounded steadier than she felt. They finished the session quietly, moving through the remaining stretches with a new attentiveness. Every gesture seemed imbued with meaning now, even the mundane ones. When Claire packed her bag, Rachel noticed the familiar scar on her wrist again, the way Claire's fingers moved with practiced efficiency. The ordinary details anchored her, kept the moment from dissolving into abstraction. At the door, they paused once more. The goodbye felt different now, weighted, deliberate. Claire met Rachel's gaze, her expression open, unguarded. "I'll see you tomorrow," Claire said. "Yes," Rachel replied. The word carried more than agreement. It felt like acknowledgement. After Claire left, Rachel stood alone in the quiet house, her body still resonating with the memory of contact. She pressed her fingertips together, then let them fall apart, noticing the faint echo of warmth that lingered. The kiss replayed in her mind, not the act itself, but the pause that followed, the way it had left her unmoored. She moved through the rest of the day in a kind of suspension. Grocery shopping, emails, a brief call with Daniel that felt strangely distant, as if she were speaking from another room. The world looked the same, yet everything felt slightly misaligned, as though she were seeing it through a lens that had been subtly shifted. That night, lying in bed, Rachel found herself returning to the same image again and again. Claire's hand hovering, waiting. The choice she had made in leaning forward. The awareness that settled in her chest and did not leave. It was not desire alone that unsettled her. It was the clarity that came with it, the sense that something had been set in motion that could not be undone. She closed her eyes, letting the feeling wash over her without trying to resolve it. Tomorrow would come. The house would wake again. The mat would unroll. The windows would open. And somewhere inside her, the quiet crossing would continue to reverberate, asking to be lived with, not explained. The first thing Rachel noticed was the quiet. Not the ordinary morning quiet, the kind that settled naturally into the house when dawn arrived before she was ready, but a heavier version, one that pressed against her ears and refused to soften. It felt earned, accumulated, as if the silence had been waiting for her to wake up so it could remind her of what had already happened. Her body remembered before her mind caught up. The faint ache in her jaw from where she had held herself too carefully the night before. The warmth behind her sternum, dulled now, but unmistakably present. The precise recollection of Claire's breath near her cheek, close enough to register, far enough to deny. Rachel stayed in bed longer than usual, staring at the pale ceiling, tracking the slow fan of light as it crept across the wall. Each minute felt deliberate, like a decision she wasn't making. Eventually, the world nudged her forward. Hunger. Habit. The need to move so the thoughts wouldn't harden. Downstairs, she went through the familiar motions. Kettle on, mug out, curtains open just enough to let the morning in without fully committing. The house responded as it always did. Quiet, receptive, obedient. She resented that a little today. When the doorbell rang, the sound landed differently than before. It didn't bring relief. It brought awareness. Rachel opened the door, already braced. Claire stood there, posture steady, expression carefully neutral. If there was anything behind it, hesitation, regret, anticipation, it stayed contained. Rachel felt the absence of yesterday's openness like a pressure change. "Morning," Claire said. "Morning." They didn't linger in the doorway this time. Claire stepped inside with efficiency, setting her bag down, unrolling the mat. The movements were the same as always, but stripped of ease. Rachel noticed how much effort it took not to watch her hands. They began without discussion. The warm-up felt mechanical, useful, necessary. Claire's instructions were precise, clipped. Rachel followed them with equal care, grateful for the distance professionalism provided. Their bodies moved in parallel rather than conversation, close but not touching. It was an ordinary session. That was the problem. Rachel felt the weight of what they were not addressing settle into her shoulders. The kiss, small, contained, irrevocable, hung between them without shape or permission to exist. She kept waiting for it to assert itself, to demand reckoning. It didn't. It simply stayed. During a stretch, Rachel's knee drifted too close to Claire's again. This time Claire shifted away immediately, subtle but decisive. The correction landed harder than any touch could have. Rachel swallowed. Her breath came uneven for a moment before she steadied it. She told herself it was for the best. That restraint was care. That distance was respect. Inside, her thoughts splintered rather than formed. She cycled through familiar defenses. It was brief, it was mutual, it meant nothing, it meant too much. None of them settled. They finished the session without comment. In the kitchen, Rachel poured water into 2 glasses out of habit before realizing she hadn't asked. Claire accepted one with a nod. They stood across from each other at the counter, the space between them newly pronounced. "About yesterday," Claire began, then stopped. Rachel's pulse jumped. She waited, attentive, open despite herself. Claire exhaled slowly. "I want to be clear." Rachel nodded, though she wasn't sure what she was agreeing to yet. "That shouldn't happen again," Claire said. Her voice was calm, uninflected. "Not like that." The words landed cleanly. No accusation, no apology. Just boundary. Rachel felt the immediate, almost reflexive urge to agree, to smooth the moment. She held it back. "I understand," she said instead. The truth of it surprised her. She did understand. Understanding didn't make it easier to inhabit. They stood there in silence, the hum of the refrigerator filling the space where something else might have gone. Rachel noticed the way Claire's fingers tightened briefly around the glass before relaxing again. The restraint mirrored her own. Outside, a delivery truck passed. Somewhere down the street, a door slammed. The world, indifferent and precise, kept its schedule. Claire checked her watch. "I should go." "Yes," Rachel said. The word felt insufficient, but she let it stand. At the door they paused out of habit, then seemed to realize it at the same time. Claire stepped back first, creating space with intention. "I'll see you tomorrow," she said, her tone professional even. Rachel nodded. "Tomorrow." After the door closed, Rachel remained where she was, her hand hovering just above the handle. She didn't touch it. The absence felt physical, a hollow where contact had been. The rest of the day unfolded with a muted heaviness. Emails answered. Groceries unpacked. A brief call from Daniel that she navigated with practiced ease. His voice sounded distant, benign. She responded appropriately, efficiently. It felt like speaking through glass. In the afternoon, she stood before the canvas again. The horizon she had been working toward now felt suddenly charged, dangerous. She lifted the brush, hesitated, set it down. The choice to paint or not felt too closely aligned with another decision she wasn't ready to make. As evening settled, Rachel noticed the way her body held tension, jaw tight, shoulders drawn. The restraint she had agreed to lived in her muscles, demanded constant attention. It was exhausting. She went to bed early, then lay awake for hours, replaying the moment in the kitchen. Not the words themselves, but the care with which they had been delivered. Claire hadn't withdrawn out of fear. She had drawn the line out of responsibility. That realization unsettled Rachel more than anger would have. In the dark, she imagined what it would feel like to cross that boundary again, not impulsively, not accidentally, but with full awareness of the cost. The thought didn't resolve into decision. It stretched, taut, and unfinished. Somewhere near morning, sleep claimed her at last. Even then, the feeling remained. Not desire exactly, but the weight of a choice deferred, pressing gently but relentlessly against her consciousness. Rachel woke before the alarm, already holding the day inside her body as if it had weight. Not heaviness exactly, more density, a sense that something unresolved had settled into her muscles overnight and refused to loosen. She lay still, listening to the house breathe around her. Pipes cooled. A distant engine passed and faded. The world was already moving, unconcerned with the careful suspension she was living inside. The choice had not announced itself yet. That was the strange part. There had been no clear decision in the dark, no moment of clarity sharp enough to name. Only a steady knowing that whatever came next would not be dramatic. It would be quiet. It would require her to remain present rather than brave. She got up, showered, dressed. The mirror returned her face to her without commentary. She looked older than she had a week ago, not in years, but in focus. She tied her hair back, then let it fall loose again, undecided. In the kitchen, she poured coffee and forgot it on the counter, distracted by the way the light caught the edge of the table. Everything felt slightly sharpened, as if the world had adjusted its contrast. When the doorbell rang, she didn't flinch. Claire stood outside with the same composed posture, but Rachel saw immediately what it cost her to maintain it. The careful neutrality, the way her hands stayed busy with the strap of her bag. They greeted each other without ceremony, and this time the lack of pretense felt like honesty. They moved into the house together. The mat stayed rolled. No one reached for it. Instead, they stood in the kitchen, side by side, as if drawn there by habit rather than intention. Rachel poured a second cup of coffee without asking. Claire accepted it with a small nod, their fingers brushing briefly in the exchange. The contact was unremarkable and unmistakable. It landed in Rachel's chest and stayed. They drank in silence. The coffee tasted stronger than usual. Bitter, grounding. Rachel watched the way Claire leaned her hip lightly against the counter, the way she shifted her weight from one foot to the other, as if calibrating herself to the space. The familiarity of the gesture softened something in Rachel. It felt domestic in a way that startled her. "I thought about what you said," Rachel said finally. Her voice sounded steady, almost distant, as if it belonged to someone else. Claire didn't look at her right away. She set her mug down carefully, aligning it with the edge of the counter. So did I. The pause that followed was not empty. It was full of restraint, of everything they had chosen not to say. Rachel let it stretch. She had learned over the last days that rushing would only flatten the truth. "I don't want to pretend it didn't matter," Rachel said. The words felt plain, unadorned, honest. "But I don't want to make it something it isn't either." Claire turned then, her expression open, unguarded. "Neither do I." They stood facing each other, the distance between them deliberate. Rachel felt the familiar tension gather in her shoulders, the instinct to brace. She let it go. She had spent too long protecting herself from feelings she could name only in hindsight. "I'm not asking you to cross a line," Rachel continued. "I just don't want to erase what happened." Claire exhaled slowly. "I drew that boundary because I needed to," she said. "Not because I regret it." The distinction mattered more than Rachel had realized. She felt it settle into her body like a release. Not relief, something steadier. Acceptance. They moved to the living room together. Not touching, but aware of each other's presence in a way that felt newly intentional. They sat on opposite ends of the couch, close enough to share warmth, far enough to preserve space. Outside, the day unfolded. A neighbor's laughter, the low hum of traffic, the ordinary sounds of life continuing. Rachel's thoughts drifted inward, circling the same realization from different angles. She did not want a rupture. She did not want secrecy. She wanted truth lived at a human pace, even if it meant uncertainty. Especially if it meant uncertainty. She turned to Claire. "I'm not ready to define this," she said, "but I'm not willing to lie to myself about it anymore." Claire met her gaze. "I can live with that," she said quietly. The decision did not arrive with fanfare. It simply settled between them, unspoken but agreed upon. They did not move closer right away. They let the space hold, let the choice breathe. Eventually Claire shifted, resting her hand on the cushion between them. Palm open, tightening. Not reaching, not withdrawing. The gesture felt like an invitation that respected refusal as much as consent. Rachel watched it for a long moment, then placed her own hand beside it. Not touching, close enough to feel the heat. They stayed like that, bodies angled toward each other, breath slowing. Rachel became acutely aware of the way her body responded, not with urgency but with recognition. The warmth in her chest deepened, spread. She felt grounded in a way she hadn't in years. When Claire finally leaned in, it was gradual, a movement Rachel could track moment by moment. Their shoulders brushed. Rachel's breath caught, then steadied. She turned her head slightly, resting it against Claire's shoulder. The contact was simple, unadorned. It carried no promise beyond itself. They remained there, letting the sensation register fully. The weight of Claire's arm against her back, the faint scent of soap and skin, the sound of their breathing aligning. Rachel noticed how her body relaxed into the contact, how the constant vigilance she had carried began to loosen. Time passed without announcement. They spoke little. When they did, it was about small things, work schedules, the weather shifting toward autumn, a book Claire had been reading. The conversation felt ordinary, and that ordinariness felt radical. Eventually Claire stood to leave. The movement felt natural, unforced. At the door they paused, the familiar threshold now imbued with new meaning. "This doesn't fix everything," Claire said. Rachel smiled faintly. "I know, but it feels honest." "Yes." Claire hesitated, then leaned in, pressing a brief kiss to Rachel's temple. The gesture was tender, restrained. It left a warmth that lingered long after she stepped back. After the door closed, Rachel remained where she was, hand resting against the wood. She did not feel abandoned. She felt anchored. The days that followed unfolded without drama. Rachel and Claire continued to see each other, their interactions grounded in the quiet understanding they had reached. Sometimes they trained. Sometimes they didn't. Sometimes they sat together in companionable silence, sharing space without touching. Other times a hand would find an arm, a shoulder, a back, each contact deliberate, consent renewed in every pause. Rachel spoke to Daniel. The conversation was difficult, but not explosive. They named the distance that had grown between them, the ways they had both contributed to it. There were tears. There was sadness. There was relief. The ending was not abrupt. It was human. Life resumed, altered but ongoing. Rachel returned to her painting. The canvas shifted under her hands, the horizon widening. She did not rush it. She allowed the image to emerge at its own pace, trusting the process she had resisted for so long. Claire became a constant in her life, not as an answer, but as a presence. They navigated the uncertainty together, attentive to the weight of their choices, unwilling to reduce them to simplicity. Some evenings Rachel would catch herself returning to the same thought. Not desire, not fear, but the quiet certainty that she was living closer to herself than she ever had before. The feeling repeated, settled. It held. She stood at the window one night, watching the lights flicker on across the bay, and felt the permanence not as a conclusion, but as a commitment. To honesty, to presence, to the slow work of inhabiting her own life. Some truths do not arrive fully formed. They gather through touch, silence, and the courage to remain. What would it mean to choose yourself, even when the shape of that choice is still becoming? If this story touched your heart, share your truth in the comments. And if this journey stayed with you, please consider subscribing to Secret Garden Stories, leaving a comment, and sharing it with friends, forums, and social media. Your support helps this channel grow and build a world with more love and less prejudice. Thank you for being here.